Yep, we are going to record this session and it just started. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our MiPAAC lunchtime Zoom chat. Today, we're going to be discussing current legislation in Michigan related to literacy and dyslexia. Next, Kara. And I'm Heather Eckner. I serve as the statewide Director for Education and Outreach at the Autism Alliance of Michigan. Joining us for our panel today, we have student Henri Hagland, along with educators and experts on dyslexia, Susan Schmidt and Dr. David Winters, who have helped with the writing of the legislation. We also welcome school administrators, Stephen Keskes and Dr. Nikolai Viti, who will be sharing their perspectives and experiences as well. Next. Both the literacy and dyslexia legislation efforts, as well as those of MiPAAC, are part of grassroots movements. And we are committed with MiPAAC to student and family-centered advocacy that reflects the needs and concerns of our communities across the state. With our goal of helping to educate, we knew the topic of dyslexia and literacy has been at the forefront of many families' concerns for a while now. Next. So without further delay, let's get started with our panel. We want to be sure to have time at the end of the hour for questions as well, and you can use the chat, and we'll try to help kind of keep the flow of conversation going along with the chat during the panel too. So next is Henri. Henri, why don't you introduce yourself and then share with us your experience and perspective.
Hello, everyone. My name is Henri, and I am very excited to be on here. And here's my presentation. Hi, my name is Henri. I'm in 7th grade, and I have dyslexia. I'm on an IEP and getting extra help in school. When I was younger, I never wanted to read.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Henri, could you speak louder, please?
Yes. I've never wanted to read as far back as 1st grade. In 3rd grade, the teacher wanted us to read out loud, and I was afraid I would make mistakes or take too long. Then they didn't give me good strategies to sound out words. They said to go back and slide through it, which didn't help. They only had me read a book and talk about what I remembered from the book. But it was hard to remember since I couldn't read all the words. Teachers didn't spend time with me on writing and spelling. I only remember learning the magic E. Now things are different. I'm working with a teacher that teaches me differently. First, she figures out which kinds of words I don't know. Then she works on them with me. I wasn't able to read long words. Now I can read long words. I remember I didn't know the sound of DGE, TCH, and TION. Now I've learned the different ways to different syllable types and what sounds the vowels make. Instead of saying to slide through words, she had taught me how to blend sounds and break words into syllables to decode them. I can read harder things now and understand it. I should have learned these things sooner. School is so much easier now. This should be taught to all kids when they're younger. Now I feel confident about how I read and spell.
Thank you, Henri. You did a nice job.
Thank you.
Okay, Heather, you're muted.
Thank you. So Susan and Dr. Winters, can you help us better understand the legislation and what it addresses? Carrie, you can go to next.
Hi, it's really great to be with all of you here today. I think the turnout is very inspiring. I'm excited with Dr. Winters. We'll go over what we can tell you about the legislation. I'm excited to discuss this because this legislation has been crafted on the current research about reading from the fields of psychology, neuroscience, speech and language, and education. And that I think that's a big emphasis that everybody needs to understand, is that we've really attached this to what the research is telling us. I spent a lifetime working with students like Henri, trying to teach them to read. And I started teaching in 1979. And it wasn't until 1998, when I took training at the Michigan Dyslexia Institute, that it became clear to me that there was a whole body of knowledge that I had not been exposed to as an educator. And since that time, since 98, I watched my colleagues also struggling with teaching reading, as well as remediating reading and intervening with children that had problems. And it really hasn't changed till today. I mean, we see some universities using what science is teaching us, but there really is a huge void in this space. The bills have brought together peer-reviewed science to teach us how to do three important things. How to screen children that are at risk for reading difficulties and dyslexia early, so that we can intervene. Also, they look at teacher training to make sure that teachers can become expert at teaching reading. And the third thing that the bills do is look at the instructional methods that are the most effective. Next slide, please. I don't think it's any surprise that any of us that are following the statistics about reading nationally, but here in Michigan also, probably for the last 40 years, we've seen a very flat graph as far as the children that are proficient. And when we say proficient, we mean they've met the bar. It doesn't mean they're super readers. So here in Michigan, if you look back at 2019, which is pre-COVID, when things were more normal and our scores meant something more accurately, you know, we're seeing 32% of children proficient. That is just inexcusable. And we know that we need to do something very differently than what has been happening to meet the other 68% of children. Next slide, please. Now, Mississippi is a case in point. So Mississippi was always a state that myself as an educator, we would always say, well, things are bad, but not as bad as Mississippi. And that is not the case anymore. Mississippi, over the last 20 years or so, starting with private money and then their Department of Education came on board, they have taken bold moves to educate teachers, to do proper screening, and to actually change the way kids are taught to read. And as you can see on the orange line in this graph, their trajectory is one of the only ones in the state that we see as moving up. Now, granted, they're only up to where the national average is, but I think it won't be a surprise to see that trajectory continue to move. And the things that they have integrated into what they're doing in Mississippi, and we're seeing happening all over the country in a number of states, are some of the things that are being incorporated into this legislation. Next slide. Now, we know there are some primary factors that will affect low scores for all kids in reading. One of the big ones, which is very hard for us to solve, is poverty. And we know that's an overarching concern. But there are some things that we can change and we have control over. And so the bills look at these three things: inadequate early screening, inadequate teacher training, and when we're using inconsistent application of literacy practices that are grounded in what the science tells us. So these are the three things that the bills are going to address. I do want to point out, though, as we look at these bills, understand that we're trying to do things to identify children that need interventions, or to make sure that we're doing right by them in the classroom. This bill is not about diagnosing a child with dyslexia. We're looking for characteristics. So that's something to keep in mind. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the first bullet here, and then I'll have Dr. Winters pick up the rest of this slide. So one of the really important things about this legislation is, what are we doing to find the children in the early grades, starting in kindergarten, that are at risk for reading failure or at risk for dyslexia? Currently, when the third grade reading law passed in 2013, we know that as part of that language, there was mention of making sure we had reliable and valid screening and diagnostic assessments. Unfortunately, due diligence was not taken at that time, and a definition was not specified as to what we mean when we say valid and reliable. So what has happened in this legislation, very mindfully, language has been chosen to define the screening instrument so that we can identify children in the early grades that are going to have some indicators that tell us that they will struggle reading or struggle with dyslexia. And knowing that information is so crucial, because then we can make sure that we follow through doing the kinds of things we need to do so that they're not behind. The alternative to that, which is what we see happening in schools today, is the wait to fail model. So we are basically watching children and expecting an epiphany to happen with some of these children, that they'll just figure it out. And we're trying to be much more proactive and say, we've got to find these indicators, make sure we surround them with support, and then progress monitor them. David, if you want to go ahead with the rest of the bullets.
Thank you, Susan. You know, I am so pleased to be here today. I've been working with the area of dyslexia since the 70s, and have seen many different things happening. And I've always thought, you know, maybe the best way to help our children and individuals with dyslexia is to try to get it built into legislation somehow. And so I'm really excited about this process. One of the things that this legislation is doing is trying to work to improve the training that's happening for both the future and the current educators, and helping them to understand more about what dyslexia is, the characteristics of it, some of the consequences that go along with dyslexia, and also some accommodations that you can do in the classroom. Now, this is often missing in teacher education. I'm at a university, and very often, you know, there's a brief mention of dyslexia. There might be just a brief lecture if possible. Some don't even get that. And so one of the things that this legislation does is to ensure that we're trying to include all students with characteristics of dyslexia. And because of that, we're not dealing just with the future educators. This legislation deals with making sure that current educators get the knowledge that they need so that they can make the changes that they need. And, you know, and I think it's important, Susan might have already mentioned this, but it's really important that this legislation is not aimed at diagnosing dyslexia. It's focusing on students who have the characteristics of dyslexia. What can we do to help them? The second or the third bullet is that this legislation will empower educators, because they're going to have knowledge of what structured language and literacy is. They're going to have a better knowledge of the three-tiered system of support, especially as it relates to literacy. A few years ago, some research was done, or some compilation of research was done, and it became aware that at least 50% of children find learning to read difficult without some significant support through direct code-based, systematic, sequential, and explicit instruction. That's 50%. And unfortunately, many of our teachers don't have the knowledge that they need for the background to be able to help them. And the teachers are really aware of this. In the classes that I teach, in the training that I do, I often hear from them that I have this child, I don't know what to do for this child. They get really frustrated because they want to do a good job. they depend on their training. Well, this legislation is going to empower them. And it's going to go further than the read by grade 3 law. This legislation doesn't replace that law that was enacted a few years ago and implemented, but it builds on it. It extends on it. I was listening to a conference that I was attending virtually over last weekend, and they were talking about the fact that a lot of the legislation that deals with screening stops at grade 3, but people with dyslexia still have difficulties after grade 3. So why stop? And one of the things I'm pleased with this legislation is that it does provide for screening above grade 3. And related to that then is the teacher credentialing and certification process, and including in that this requirement to know about structured language and literacy, dyslexia, and Michigan's 3-tiered system of support framework. For too many years, well over 40 years, we've been, I think, as a nation, just satisfied to keep the status quo. And sometimes I hear where people are trying things out and they'll change the terminology. For example, some of the early dyslexia legislation, but there was no change in practice. So one of the things that this legislation does is ensure that there has to be a change in practice. And the way that you do that is through the teacher credentialing, the certification. So this is going to require the teacher preparation programs in the state, as well as school districts, to ensure that there is improved training about dyslexia, and also the intervention of in instruction. Not that everybody's going to be credentialed to be able to intervene with dyslexia, but every teacher needs to know the characteristics of dyslexia. And one of the ways that this is going to be helped is through another aspect of this legislation, which is a dyslexia guidebook. This dyslexia guidebook is going to be developed by an advisory board that one of the pieces of legislation establishes, that's within the Michigan Department of Education. And that guidebook will be used by schools across Michigan to see how to implement the other aspects of this legislation. And as this was being framed, there was a purposeful approach to make sure that this advisory board had broad representation. So for example, somebody that understands and practices as a dyslexia interventionist, somebody from higher education that has knowledge about how higher education works, that goes into the teacher credentialing, for example, and the teacher prep. A person with evidence-based literacy instruction with expertise there for English language learners, because English language learners bring an additional set of issues to be able to deal with. And then also for at least 2 members, I think, to be school staff, like teachers, administrators, that have expertise in screening and interventions. And then an individual with dyslexia or a parent or guardian will be on this board. So we get that perspective. Speech language pathologists. In the training I do for structured language and literacy, so often we find speech language pathologists taking the training because they know that they don't just work with oral language, that there's a correlation between oral language and written language. So that field will be represented, as well as school psychology. All of the people on this advisory board will all have expertise and experience with dyslexia. And through this legislation, we can see, we believe, a significant turn in the ability of our students being able to learn how to read and become literate. So next slide.
I
Thank
keep
you,
trying to unmute. Yeah, thank you. Susan, do you want to actually introduce Stephen and Dr. Beatty, or they can introduce themselves and we'd like to hear from their perspectives?
Yeah, I'll introduce them. I've come across, well, through this journey, this over 2 years working with Senators Runstead, Senator Pohanke, Senator, I'm just blank here, Runstead, Senator Tice, who's chair of the committee, and Senator Irwin. We have reached out to people all over the state and all over the country as this legislation's been developed. And two people that have really struck me as really on the cutting edge of what's going on in school districts are Stephen Keskis and Dr. Nikolai Vitti. And so they were invited today to talk about what they've actually seen, because they've made this happen in their districts. So I think Stephen was going to speak first. So Stephen, if you'd like to lead, that'd be great.
Sure. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share this important work with all of you today. In my previous role as Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction with the Clio Area School District, we really started looking at our multi-tiered system of support and tried to figure out different interventions for children. As we knew, based on the feedback that we were hearing from our teachers, they were coming in early, staying late every day, and were coming to some pain points and frustrations around, like, what can I do? I've tried all of the interventions that are in all of the textbooks and all the training that they had, and they knew that they were losing kids. And so we decided that we were going to look at some different ways of intervening. And at the time, it was Orton Gillingham, but also known as structured language, had come into play as an opportunity to do something different. You know, we just, slower and louder wasn't an intervention. We didn't want to keep doing the same things over and over again and expect a different result, and only changing the context. So we started this as a tier 3 intervention, and then that became a tier 2 intervention, working with small groups of students, and then eventually had the opportunity to partner with a group in the Bay City area, Children's Choice Initiative, and we're able to teach our tier 1 teachers how to utilize structured language in a traditional classroom. We were not specifically looking to identify children with dyslexia. We were just noticing that we needed to do something different early. And as I'm hearing Henri's words, you know, in first grade or second grade or third grade, like, we felt like we needed to just start with utilizing this in our classrooms. And I worked with some amazing teachers who took on this work and were utilizing this in their kindergarten classrooms and then first grade classrooms. So students were learning structured language alongside of our traditional whole language approaches to teaching children how to read. And one of the things that we really found exciting was that just our teacher efficacy, the belief that they knew that they could intervene with their children in their classrooms, started going through the roof. Teachers were excited that they now had a tool in their toolbox that they didn't have previously, because, as was mentioned, you know, they didn't hear about this in their teacher, you know, education courses when they were going through college or university. Very few places to learn how to use this different approach to reading, and they could keep these children in their classrooms and didn't have to have them taken out for a tier 3 intervention that may or may not work. So for me, what's most exciting about the science of reading and to leverage this kind of way of teaching children how to read is we're keeping kids in our classroom with their peers, and we're not creating additional gaps by taking them out of their tier 1 instruction. We know that it's possible. We know that this works. And so my experience in Clio area schools was this was amazing for kids. It was amazing for our teaching staff, and we were leveraging just from a financial standpoint, we're really leveraging our at-risk dollars and our and some of our read by third grade, our 35A monies to make this happen for our kids in the community. And so I just wanted to share sort of our story and sort of how we got to where we were and how our kids are now, we're moving needles and beyond predictive poverty measures, at least in the Clio area school district, where I just recently left. And my teachers are amazing and going above and beyond what's expected. But again, just to reiterate, it was exciting because it was empowering those teachers because they needed that tool and we were able to deliver it for them. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Vitti because I know you guys have been doing some amazing work in Detroit.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. Great to hear all the ideas, voices, and advocacy around this issue. For me, this is personal and professional. I am dyslexic. 3 of my 4 children are dyslexic. So this has been a personal journey as a learner, and it's been a personal journey as a parent. And coupled with that, being superintendent. So you have to work through this in a school system as well. There's so much to say, so I'll try to break it down in different buckets and thoughts. First of all, anything that comes from the legislature, this is going to sound political, but anything that comes from the legislature always scares superintendents and systems in general. Because sometimes it's not always understood. B, it's not often funded. And C, it can feel political. And so I would say there's nothing about this legislation that is political. It is research-based. It's what we should have been doing for students a long time ago. And it's always a difficult conversation to talk about practice changing, if you will, through legislation for the reasons I just named. But I think it's necessary to think about a pathway through law because the law can require and ensure certain things are happening that should be happening for children within school systems. And I think this is one of those examples. This should be an apolitical conversation because it's research-based and it needs to happen yesterday for all students. The other thing is there's a lot of conversation about dyslexia and what this means for dyslexic students. There's no question that this legislation and the practices linked to it will benefit dyslexic students, but actually the practices will benefit all students, dyslexic or not. We all educators have been in the middle of wars with whole language, phonics-based literacy. And they're not to take a stance, but there is something to be said about both philosophies. But at the end of the day, there is a certain way that we should be teaching children how to read, and there's a certain way that we should think about how we help struggling readers how to read better. And we don't do that collectively and uniformly as school systems. It's not the fault of teachers. It's not the fault of principals. It's often not the fault of superintendents and school boards. When we learn as educators how to teach literacy, often the science of reading, multi-sensory explicit reading instruction is not part of that development to become an educator or an educational leader. So you can't do what you don't know how to do. And so part of this legislation is requiring that when teachers are trained to be teachers, this is embedded in their preparation so that they can better understand it, implement it, and advocate for it when they get into classrooms. So in DPSCD, Detroit Public Schools Community District, we've been on this journey to better implement the science of reading. And so that started by training our paraeducators, our academic interventionists. Academic interventionists are those with a bachelor's degree without teaching degrees that are taught how to work with students that are 2 or more grade levels below, from kindergarten through 9th grade, in one-on-one or small groups using Orton Gillingham based materials. And I emphasize Orton Gillingham because that is a research-based structure that's multisensory, that activates all the neurons in the brain that are not typically activated for dyslexic students and other students. So even if you're not dyslexic and you're a struggling reader, by being exposed to that level of instruction, you're going to benefit from it because it's a different way of approaching sounds and letters and blending. And so we've trained our academic interventionists to use Orton Gillingham-based materials to work with students K through 9 during the school day. We struggle sometimes having better attendance after school and on weekends, so we do the intervention during the day. And we've also trained our paraeducators that are focused more in kindergarten only to work with those students. We use an assessment called iReady, which is created by Curriculum Associates. I don't think it's the ideal dyslexic screener, if you will, but it is a good way to know what students are at grade level and what are the skills that they lack to be at grade level. And then we use that to identify those that are 2 or grade levels below. And then again, we use our paraeducators, our academic interventionists in a tier 2, tier 3 type of way. You know, there's a lot of conversation about tiered intervention, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. What we often lack in school districts is explicit tier 3 intervention. I mean, I can vividly remember talking, this was when I was chief academic officer, in school districts and being in IEP meetings about tier 3 intervention. There's a lot of confusion out there about what tier 3 is. Tier 3 is not, you know, being on a computer and, you know, doing reading exercises, or it's not, you know, extra practice work with workbooks and answering questions about what is the main idea or author's purpose. Just because you may be working with the student one-on-one and using those practices, that's not tier 3. And so there's just a lot of information, a lot of learning that still needs to happen. But I believe this legislation sets the stage. It creates a framework of understanding and intentionality to ensure that universities and school districts and schools work differently for not only dyslexic students, but all students that may be struggling in the reading process. I'd also say that I don't think that this is necessarily about more funding. And I know some may disagree with me on that. It's just thinking differently about how we're using funding. You know, how exactly are districts and schools using Title I, for example, if you're in a Title I district. You know, 31A money is another example, really, even outside of Title I. You know, even general revenue funds, professional development funds, you know, how are you spending your dollars for professional development? There's no reason why there can't be investment in the science of reading for teachers, for principals to have that training. That's not about more money. It's about thinking differently about how you're using your current dollars and focusing again on the science of reading. I try to stay away from catch words or ed speak, but you know, for those that aren't familiar with this conversation, just do your homework and, you know, just go ahead and directly Google Orton Gillingham, Google science of reading. And I think all of that would lead you down a path to just read more about what multisensory explicit reading intervention looks like. And then ask yourself as a parent, is this what my child has access to? You know, is this what's happening in the class if they're below? You know, school districts, what are you doing for more explicit tier 3 instruction? And so it's a journey. And unfortunately, it's one that most families who are not in the middle class, upper middle class, well-educated don't know about. You know, we accept the notion that certain students are slow, you know, or school is not for everyone. It's really has nothing to do with intelligence. It simply has to do that children learn differently, and they need that explicit intervention to reach their God-given talent. And literacy has to be foundational to the learning experience. And there is nothing about dyslexia or being a struggling reader that does not lead someone to learn how to read. It's just a matter of how we teach them and work with them. And as systems in this country, we have not done a very good job of working with students that don't get it the first time or don't get it in the way in which we teach it. And that needs to change. The problem is not the student. The problem is not the parent or the family. The challenge is how we respond to a situation when children don't pick up reading or literacy the way we universally teach it, which is not universally the right way to teach it, especially after the initial tier 1 level instruction. So thank you for the opportunity. Really look forward to the Q&A. And again, thank you everyone for the work that you're doing behind the scenes up front for all the students in Michigan.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. You had the perfect segue into just our next couple of slides. Kara, next, please. And you touched upon this, Dr. Vitti. So, parents really shouldn't be expected to become literacy experts in order to advocate for their child and understand what's happening in their education at school. But it is helpful to learn more about what is known and understood for effective literacy instruction, which, as the panel has outlined, we've gone through a number of points that help try to explain that. When we use the word advocate, everybody has a different connotation of what does advocacy mean? What does it mean to advocate? Fundamentally, the dictionary definition is to lend voice or raise up a cause. And so, in that purest form of it, parents are the default, parents and caregivers are the default advocates for their children in school, particularly children who have been identified as eligible for special education services and supports. And so when you find yourself in those positions, I often share with parents one of the most fundamental tips in effective advocacy is asking questions. So just like Dr. Vitti and the other panelists were saying, you can certainly ask your school what curriculum they're using to support literacy instruction. And as we walked through those different core aspects of the evidence-based instruction that is shown to work, it has these elements in it. And so we want to make sure that that is getting out to families. They're learning and understanding, because then it does connect to how does policy impact our systems that we all operate in. Next slide, Kara, please. And so before we head into questions and answer panel time, we do want to just make sure that families know where they can take next steps. So for this, specifically for this legislation package, in order to learn more, your next step can be to visit the Michigan Dyslexia Laws website. I mentioned earlier that this effort has really been led by grassroots movement. The Michigan Dyslexia Laws website was created by parents Denise Diaz and Guy Suter. So we thank them for their contributions and time volunteering to build the platform. And this is so that everyone has a place to go for more information, accurate information on what is in this literacy bill package. We also encourage parents, advocates, and attorneys who work on behalf of students with disabilities and their families to please connect with MiPAAC, as these are the exact types of issues that we're engaging with across the state and helping to move forward, to raise up and to shine a light on more actions and information that families can take. So let's go into our questions. And I've been kind of tracking within the chat, and so I will continue to do that. But I think first I want to circle back, and maybe Dr. Vitti, you can talk a little bit more about, and other panelists can jump in. You mentioned specifically providing teachers with Orton Gillingham training. I know another commonly used training is called LETRS, LETRS, LETRS training. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe those opportunities that are available across the state? Because as I understand it, there is an initiative now where some letters training can be made available with state funding to support it. So back to your point of, it's not always about more funding, it's about how we're using funding.
Yeah, so letters is what we're using. We partnered with BrainSpring as our partner to provide the professional development. And I know that there are other entities out there that's providing the training, but you know, as I think about it, maybe being more explicit with districts with what are, you know, naming those entities that do it well and that are research based could be helpful. But we partnered with BrainSpring to provide our training to our academic interventionists, paras. We also trained our principals on it as well, and then also expanded that training to the early grade level teachers. So kindergarten to third grade, and then now we're expanding into the upper grades as well.
Great, thank you. Susan, I think what I want to come back to is an earlier point that you touched on was just about the universal screening. Can you tell us a little bit more about specifically, because in the points you covered, it was the validated screening. So can you talk more about that?
Sure. So when you think about screeners in general, you know, there was a piece that was out in the International Dyslexia Association Journal that looked at screeners that were being used in Texas and maybe Arkansas that were missing kids because the screeners were comprehension based. And what we're trying to do with the criteria that is listed on what a screener should look like is we're looking at particular skills that we should be seeing with children in kindergarten through third grade, and they can shift a little bit, but things like can they name letters? Can they give sounds of letters? Can they blend letters together? Can they hear that there are 3 sounds in a word like cat? So research has shown us that when you look at these particular aspects of the skills that children have, we can get some indications of risk. There's one particular section of the screener, I think, that's has really, the research area on this is just, they're really excited, is that something called RAN, and it's rapid automized naming, that when you take a child, let's say a kindergartner who doesn't know any of his letters, so it's like, how am I going to assess this child? You can have him look at a group of pictures, and it's how quickly they can name them. They're pictures that are real common things like a pencil, you know, a hat, a chair. And children that have delays there tend to have difficulties learning to read. And so we've been very thoughtful about looking at what the research tells us are going to be the type of screener that will do what we're asking it to do to make it a valid screener. It actually catches the children that we are trying to find that both will be at risk for reading failure or at risk for dyslexia. And so those are some of the details. If you look at Bill 380 and you go to the definition section, which is at the end of the bill, it actually gives the components of what that would look like.
And just if people do want to look at any of the bills, and specifically that one 380, that is on the Michigan Dyslexia Laws website. Each of those bills is linked and they can access them there. Is that correct?
Yes, all the bills are on there. And I want to just add on, not related to that, but just something else that was mentioned earlier. Dr. Beatty mentioned about the training that his educators. I love that they included administrators in the training, because we know as a teacher, my principal and my superintendent where I would work, they're supposed to be the curriculum leaders. I understand they have to handle budgets and discipline and everything, but they can't be a curriculum leader. They can't evaluate my teaching without knowledge. So I think it's really important that they've done that, and that's incorporated in this legislation.
Thank you. So one of the questions in the chat is, so some of these questions that are coming up relate to, okay, so we've now encouraged, you know, parents to ask these questions about the instruction and curriculum happening at their school. And there are some, whenever it gets to the students who have been identified for special education services and supports, that maybe, some school professionals are pushing back because they say the legislation limits what is in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the statute that mandates the special education aspects that we know. So in parent-friendly language, can any of our panelists address some of that opposition, that just how this interplay with special education, because as you've reiterated, it's not about special education, it's about all of the instruction that happens. And then this may help identify kids who should be more comprehensively evaluated for special education. But I do think that that's a point at which many are confused, and parents kind of hear a lot of lingo speak in that. So if we could kind of maybe talk about that in, again, those parent-friendly terms, that would be great.
I'd like to address this. So we know that what this legislation is focused on is what's happening in the early years in Tier 1. We have to identify kids that are at risk. And then what are we doing in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 and this isn't about what we're telling special ed to do. But what we know is that once children are getting Tier 2, which is more duration and frequency of instruction, and they're not responding, and perhaps we're ramping it up to Tier 3. Basically, the legislation says, which is what happens now, a child goes through a comprehensive testing. The school district looks at this child and says, we're trying X, Y, and Z right now in our 3 tiers of support. So now we have to do our due diligence to do perhaps a comprehensive exam, to do, so this legislation doesn't tell special ed what to do. That's already in the law. And, it's just not really, I don't know if that answers what you're asking, but they aren't directing special ed to do anything. They're going to follow IDEA and what that process is.
Thank you. I do see a hand raised from an attendee, Jessica Floyd. You can unmute, please, and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Please give me a moment. I'm gonna step into another room. I'm at work. I'm sorry.
Lunchtime Zoom chat. We know everybody's on their lunch break.
Right. So hello, everybody. This is so great. My advocate is also online. Her name is Chelsea Gertz. So my son, his name is Ronald. He's 9. He's just now entering the 4th grade. He does have an IEP. But my issue is that I don't feel like the school is able to acknowledge his dyslexia, and they continue to put it off as it's ADHD. It's not ADHD. It's not. And I really want them to be able to understand what you all understand, and they don't. And yeah. So I'm just listening to this is further putting in my mind that what I'm saying is not wrong. He's been denied speech therapy services because they said that he does not need it. But I don't agree with that. We did just change his category to OHI to, allow him to use different accommodations. But again, I need them to acknowledge the dyslexia and quit saying that it's ADHD and teach him the way that he learns. My son is very smart. You know what I'm saying? If I engage him in things that are interesting to him, like he likes the Navy, he wants to go to the Navy when he gets older and learn how to build planes and ships and things of that nature. If I engage him in that, then he's reads and speaks left to right with no problem. But then when we get into the way they want him to learn, then it becomes difficult for him.
Right. So Jessica, what I'm hearing you share right now, thank you for sharing that, is what we hear from a lot of families, similar experiences and frustrations and confusion. I think too, what you're sharing as an experience as a parent with your son is what Dr. Vitti was just talking about earlier, is that, lots of children learn in lots of different ways, and that's part of the education that needs to happen. Dr. Winters, I think going back to when you were talking about what most excited you about this bill package was some of that, it does get, this relates to dyslexia. It does not change anything about the current special education eligibility process or criteria. But can you maybe revisit, Dr. Winters, about what this finally does codify about the definition of dyslexia?
So one of the things that this legislation does is it makes sure that the general education teachers understand what dyslexia is. And through that, there will be a definition of dyslexia that's part of the legislation. This legislation does talk about the fact that if somebody doesn't respond, then the school district needs to refer them for special education services to see if they are qualified for the special ed services. The key is the best opportunity we have for helping children learn how to read is from kindergarten through second or third grade. And whatever we can do in the general education classroom to provide the experiences that they need, the types of instruction that they need there, will help probably to, the best thing would be that we would have fewer people in special ed, because learning disabilities is the largest area of special education, and dyslexia is part of that. There are a lot of people, students, who get to that stage that had they had really good instruction that was explicit, sequential, cumulative, and based on this idea of relating the reading and the spelling and to the sounds, had they done that, they probably wouldn't have gotten to the stage where they needed to be referred. And this is one of the things that the legislation is focused on. Because yes, there are some students who need one-on-one, but there are a lot of students that don't. They just need to be taught a little differently. And this will give this legislation will give the tools for that.
Thank you. Go ahead, Stephen.
I think Dr. Winters hit it on the nose. One of the challenges that we know, and I think why some school districts shy away from, and I read a little bit in the chat as well, because as an educator, I can't diagnose a student with dyslexia. That's a medical diagnosis. So the challenge is that we have a medical diagnosis, which takes a certain amount of resources to obtain in the first place, and the cure is an educational solution or a structured language or structured literacy way of learning, which is challenging for everyone to try to navigate right now, because the way the system is currently set up, once I get my medical diagnosis for dyslexia, so what, now what? I go to my school district and say, okay, here's what I have. How can you help me with this? And unless school districts have had training, which currently is not mandated, or do we have the ability to do outside of certain school districts to take that initiative, providing that solution to children is a challenge. And that's why these laws are so important, because I feel like it gives school districts the tools to be able to start working maybe differently than what we've been able to do in the past, because they simply may not have the tools or the confidence, or feel like they have the authority to be able to intervene in those ways.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. That helps. I mean, it's a very confusing system and process for families, but this is helping to kind of clarify the different lanes of what this legislation would address and how it connects, but does not change that system. But with this greater information, greater understanding, the data points that will be collected with the screeners, we'll be able to use that in the eligibility determination process, and it will help parents better understand as well. We have a little bit of time remaining, and I want to close out because we are focused today on the bill package related to this. What I'm taking away from this is there's far more learning opportunities that we can provide families to understand all of these kinds of intricacies down the path. But Susan, maybe if I circle back to you and just say, you know, we know with any kind of legislative process, this is a bipartisan bill package with sponsors, but you know, a question in the chat was just, a parent might be curious about who is really supporting this or who might not be supporting this right now, because that's part of that effort of learning more. Can you address that?
I can. You know, it's been a real effort for the group that's been working to draft this legislation to talk to different stakeholders and to understand what their hesitations are, what their concerns are. And one of the things that we've noticed is, you know, when the third grade reading law passed, screeners there was a list of screeners and diagnostic things that MDE put together. And according to the law, it said they had to be valid and reliable. And that list ended up being not carefully vetted. And so I think some of the vendors of some of those companies are a bit troubled that perhaps the language in these bills that say we've got to go back and we've got to really do our due diligence to look at the validity and reliability and what's applicable to children in K-3 to really help us find the kids that need, you know, to be flagged. I think there's some pushback there. I think there's pushback about an unfunded mandate, but something was mentioned earlier. It's more about how do you use your dollars? And we know that $4 million was set aside in this last budget that just passed for letters training for K. They're focused on more K2 teachers. Teachers can sign up for that at no cost. There's some other monies out there where Michigan Dyslexia Institute is doing some training, the Children's Choice Initiative, those things are available to people. And then I think in the administrative groups, it's as if there's pushback because we want to keep doing what we're doing because we've invested in certain programs. And I know that's frustrating. I sat on a school board in East Lansing and, you know, you spend a lot of money on certain programs, but I think, you know, a lot of districts are just, will kind of add a phonics piece and say, yeah, that's good. We're doing it. And so they're uncomfortable with the thought that they're going to have to shift. And I think Dr. Vitti mentioned it's a journey and it's hard to shift. But I think that, you know, knowledge is power. And hopefully through this, if this legislation passes and as administrators and current teachers are learning about what the science tells us, we will start to see that shift because our children are counting on us. They only have one chance at a K-12 education, and they only have one chance to really learn to read in those early grades when they're so ready. And so I see some pushback from administrative groups, but we've got great support with the speech and language pathologists, with school psychologists, with our teachers groups. And, you know, there are always going to be some teachers that are going to be the naysayers because they've been doing something for 20 years, but as they become educated, the lights come on, and it's a pretty exciting thing as I went through the same process. So I hope that answered your question.
It does. And I know I'm looking at the time and our lunchtime has come to a close. And I believe Henri probably had to go back to class as it is a school day, but I know how much we all appreciated him joining us. Thank you to each of our panelists, Susan, Dr. Winters, Stephen, Dr. Vitti. This has been really helpful. And like I said, it helps point us on a path of where we as a group want to continue to help educate families and help them understand. So I want to thank you. We really appreciate it, your time out of your days for this important discussion. Thanks everybody who joined us, and we'll try to maybe capture questions that weren't answered in the chat, and we can follow up with a resource as well with maybe like a FAQ. So thank you.
Parents, don't give up. It's possible.
Yes.
Okay. And
Right.
Gordon Gillingham-based intervention, please look it up and get it. But Miss Floyd, don't give up. Your
Yeah.
child is brilliant.
I'm not. You better believe I'm advocating for him every day. Oh no.
So Miss
No.
Lloyd, I want to get Miss Lloyd's contact info. So I don't know how I can do that, but somehow